Manhattan, New York. Saturday evening, October 12, 1935. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped out of a black sedan in front of the Waldorf-Astoria Hotel, one of the most prestigious addresses in America, wearing a custom suit that cost more than most men earned in 6 months. He had been invited to a private gambling party hosted by wealthy white businessmen who needed his expertise at the poker table and his connections in Harlem's underworld. What should have been a lucrative evening of high-stakes cards and profitable networking turned into the most brutal night in New York's criminal history. A racist barman decided to humiliate the most dangerous black gangster in Harlem in front of Manhattan's elite. The barman's words took 3 seconds to speak. The consequences took 3 hours to unfold. By dawn, 5 men would never walk properly again, and New York would learn that disrespecting Bumpy Johnson carried a price no fortune could pay. The invitation had arrived at Bumpy Johnson's Harlem apartment 3 days earlier, delivered by a nervous white messenger who clearly understood he was entering territory where his skin color made him conspicuous and potentially vulnerable. The envelope was expensive cream-colored stationery, the kind used by people who wanted recipients to understand immediately that the sender possessed wealth and refinement. Inside was a handwritten note from Marcus Castellano, a Manhattan businessman who operated legitimate import businesses that serve as fronts for various illegal enterprises, inviting Johnson to attend a private gathering at the Waldorf-Astoria Hotel on Saturday evening. The invitation was unusual but not unprecedented. Johnson had cultivated relationships with wealthy white businessmen throughout Manhattan, men who found his gambling expertise valuable at high-stakes poker games, who appreciated his ability to provide services that legitimate society couldn't offer, who recognized that Harlem's most powerful black gangster possessed intelligence and sophistication that transcended the racial prejudices they applied to other colored people. These relationships were transactional rather than social, business arrangements that benefited both parties while maintaining the fundamental separation that segregated America demanded. Johnson understood exactly why Castellano wanted him at this particular gathering. The businessman was hosting several out-of-town investors who fancied themselves skilled poker players, men with more money than sense who could be separated from substantial sums by someone who understood the mathematics of card games and the psychology of wealthy men who couldn't accept losing. Johnson would be there as Castellano's secret weapon, would win money that he and Castellano would split afterward, would provide the entertainment of watching arrogant rich men lose to someone they'd assumed was inferior. The arrangement carried risks that Johnson calculated carefully before accepting. Attending a private party at the Waldorf-Astoria meant entering white Manhattan society in ways that could generate complications. The hotel itself maintained strict policies about colored guests, policies that were sometimes relaxed for private events, but that created uncertainty about how Johnson would be received. The other guests at the party might object to playing cards with a black man regardless of Castellano's wishes, might create scenes that would embarrass everyone involved, might respond to Johnson's presence with a casual racism that white Americans considered their birthright. But Johnson decided the potential rewards justified the risks. Castellano was offering a substantial sum for Johnson's participation, money that would fund various operations Johnson was developing in Harlem. The opportunity to establish relationships with wealthy Manhattan businessmen could generate future profits that exceeded the immediate payment. And Johnson possessed supreme confidence in his ability to navigate white spaces when necessary, to present himself in ways that minimized friction while maximizing his own interests. Johnson spent Saturday afternoon preparing for the evening with a meticulous attention to appearance that characterized his public persona. He selected a navy blue suit tailored specifically for his frame, a crisp white shirt with French cuffs, a silk tie, and a conservative pattern that suggested wealth without ostentation. His shoes were polished until they reflected light like mirrors. His hair was carefully groomed, his nails trimmed, every detail of his appearance calculated to present the image of a successful businessman rather than the criminal that police files identified him as. The drive from Harlem to the Waldorf-Astoria took approximately 25 minutes. Johnson's driver, navigating through Saturday evening traffic, while Johnson reviewed the information he'd gathered about the other guests expected at Castellano's party. He knew their names, their businesses, their gambling histories, their psychological vulnerabilities. He knew which ones would become aggressive when losing, which ones would try to change games when the cards turned against them, which ones could be manipulated through flattery, and which required more subtle approaches. The Waldorf-Astoria rose above Park Avenue like a monument to American wealth, its Art Deco towers dominating the Manhattan skyline, its lobby filled with the kind of people who expected the world to accommodate their desires without question. Johnson had visited the hotel before, always through service entrances, always for meetings conducted in private rooms where his presence wouldn't disturb the sensibilities of white guests who paid premium prices partly for the assurance that they wouldn't encounter colored people except as servants. Tonight was different. Castellano had arranged for Johnson to enter through the main lobby, had cleared his attendance with hotel management, had presumably paid whatever bribes were necessary to ensure that Johnson would be admitted without incident. The arrangement represented a small victory, an acknowledgement that Johnson's value to wealthy white businessmen exceeded the inconvenience of allowing a black man to walk through spaces normally reserved for white patrons. Johnson's driver stopped at the hotel's main entrance, and Johnson emerged onto the sidewalk with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged wherever he chose to be. Doormen in elaborate uniforms observed his approach with expressions that mixed confusion with trained hospitality, uncertain how to respond to a well-dressed black man approaching their entrance, but professionally reluctant to create scenes that might embarrass the hotel. Johnson walked through the lobby without incident, his posture erect, his expression calm, his pace suggesting neither hurry nor hesitation. White guests glanced at him with varying degrees of surprise and disapproval, but no one confronted him. No one demanded to know what a colored man was doing in their hotel. He reached the elevator bank, provided Castellano's name and suite number to the operator, and ascended to the 14th floor where the private party was being held. The suite Castellano had reserved occupied a corner of the floor, multiple rooms configured for entertaining, with a main parlor where poker would be played, adjoining rooms for private conversations, a bar area where drinks were served by staff Castellano had hired for the evening. Approximately 15 people were already present when Johnson arrived, mostly men in expensive suits holding drinks and engaging in the performative socializing that preceded serious gambling. Castellano greeted Johnson warmly, shaking his hand and introducing him to other guests as a business associate from Harlem who possessed remarkable skill at cards. The introductions generated mixed reactions. Some guests accepted Johnson's presence with the practiced tolerance of businessmen who'd learned to set aside personal prejudices when money was involved. Others displayed obvious discomfort, avoiding eye contact, positioning themselves to minimize interaction with the black man who'd somehow been admitted to their gathering. The poker game began approximately 30 minutes after Johnson's arrival. 8 men seated around a table covered in green felt, substantial stacks of chips representing money that most Americans couldn't earn in a decade of labor. Johnson played conservatively at first, studying the other players, identifying their tells, calculating their risk tolerances, building the foundation for the more aggressive play that would come later when he understood exactly how to exploit each opponent's weaknesses. The game progressed smoothly for nearly 2 hours, Johnson winning consistently, but not dramatically, building his stack through patient accumulation rather than spectacular hands that might generate resentment. The other players seemed to accept his presence, seemed focused on the cards and the money rather than on the race of the man taking their chips. Castellano watched from across the table with satisfied expression, clearly pleased that his arrangement was producing the expected results. The problem began when Johnson decided to refresh his drink. He'd been nursing the same bourbon for hours, had allowed his glass to empty as the game demanded his attention, and during a break in play he walked to the bar area where a white barman in hotel uniform was serving other guests. Johnson approached the bar, placed his empty glass on the counter, and requested another bourbon. The barman, a man in his mid-30s with the ruddy complexion of someone who sampled his own inventory frequently, looked at Johnson with an expression that shifted from professional neutrality to something harder and uglier. The barman glanced around the room as if confirming what he was seeing, then turned back to Johnson with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. The words the barman spoke next would echo through New York's underworld for decades, would become legendary as an example of racism so casual and so absolute that it seemed almost innocent in its certainty that no consequences would follow. The barman leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying clearly to nearby guests who'd paused their conversations to observe what was happening, and said words that would cost him more than he could possibly have imagined. The barman's words were delivered with the casual contempt that white Americans reserved for black people who'd forgotten their place, the tone suggesting genuine confusion about why a colored man would expect to be served at a bar where respectable white people were drinking. The specific language included the word that white people use to remind black people of their supposed inferiority, followed by suggestions that Johnson should find the service entrance if he wanted something to drink, that the bar was for guests rather than for whatever help Castellano had brought from Harlem, that Johnson should be grateful he'd been allowed to sit at the poker table rather than pushing his luck by expecting to be served alcohol like he was actually human. The room fell silent. Guests who'd been engaged in conversations stopped mid-sentence, their attention drawn to the confrontation unfolding at the bar. Some expressions showed discomfort at the barman's language, the recognition that this level of explicit racism might create problems that would complicate their evening. Others showed approval or amusement, the satisfaction of seeing a black man reminded of his proper status after having been permitted to pretend equality at the poker table. Johnson stood motionless at the bar, his expression revealing nothing of the rage that was building inside him. He'd experienced racism throughout his life, had been called every slur that white Americans had invented to degrade black people, had learned to absorb these insults without visible reaction because showing anger gave racist satisfaction, and because violence in response to words created legal problems that served no one's interests. But this was different. This wasn't a stranger on the street whose insult could be walked away from and forgotten. This was a servant, a hired barman working at a private party, publicly humiliating Johnson in front of wealthy white businessmen whose respect Johnson needed to maintain his profitable relationships. The barman's words were designed not just to insult Johnson personally, but to remind everyone present that regardless of how much money Johnson possessed, regardless of how well he dressed, or how skillfully he played cards, he remained nothing more than a colored man who could be degraded by any white person who chose to do so. Castellano moved toward the bar with the panicked expression of a host watching his carefully arranged evening collapse into disaster. He spoke rapidly to the barman, his voice low but urgent, clearly attempting to defuse the situation, to get the barman to serve Johnson and pretend the confrontation hadn't happened. But the barman, apparently emboldened by the audience, or perhaps simply expressing convictions he'd always held, refused to back down. He repeated that he didn't serve colored people, and that if Castellano wanted his guests drinking, he should have hired someone willing to serve animals. The word hung in the air, the reduction of Johnson from human being to animal, the fundamental denial of dignity that lay at the heart of American racism. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. One or two moved toward the door, as if deciding the evening had become too complicated to continue. Others watched with the fascination of observers at an accident, curious to see how this would resolve, perhaps hoping for drama that would make an entertaining story to tell their friends. Johnson's mind was working with the cold precision that had made him successful in Harlem's brutal underworld. He was calculating options, evaluating consequences, determining the most effective response to what had just occurred. The immediate option of violence, of physically attacking the barman right there at the bar, would generate satisfaction but would create problems. Hotel security would be summoned. Police would be called. Johnson would be arrested, probably beaten during the arrest, would face charges that could result in prison time. The wealthy white guests would tell stories about the colored gangster who'd become violent when a barman declined to serve him, confirming every prejudice they held about black people being inherently savage. The option of verbal response, of matching the barman's insults with his own, would accomplish nothing except potentially escalating the situation toward the violence Johnson wanted to avoid in this setting. The barman clearly felt protected by the environment, believed that nothing he said to a black man in front of white guests could possibly result in meaningful consequences. Arguing with him would just provide entertainment for the watching guests. The option Johnson chose was the one that required the most self-control and that would generate the most significant long-term results. He said nothing. He held the barman's gaze for several seconds, memorizing the man's face, noting every detail that would allow him to identify this particular person later. Then Johnson nodded once, the same gesture he'd used at the Cotton Club weeks earlier, the gesture that could mean acceptance or could mean something else entirely. Johnson turned away from the bar and walked toward Castellano, who was still attempting to apologize, still offering to fire the barman immediately, still trying to salvage the evening and the profitable arrangement that Johnson's continued participation would provide. Johnson listened to Castellano's apologies without expression, then spoke quietly enough that nearby guests couldn't hear. The business between them was concluded, Johnson explained. He would be leaving now. Castellano should understand that what had happened tonight would have consequences, not for Castellano specifically, but for the barman who'd chosen to insult him and for anyone who'd supported or encouraged that insult. Johnson suggested that Castellano might want to distance himself from those consequences, might want to ensure he wasn't present when Johnson returned to address the situation through methods more appropriate than words. Castellano's face went pale as he understood what Johnson was saying. The businessman had assumed that Johnson's quiet response meant acceptance, meant that Johnson recognized he had no power in this white space and would simply absorb the humiliation like black people were expected to do. But Castellano knew Johnson's reputation, knew that the man standing before him controlled violence throughout Harlem, knew that Johnson had resources and capabilities that didn't disappear simply because he'd crossed the boundary from Harlem into Manhattan. Johnson walked out of the suite without looking back, without acknowledging the guests who watched him leave, without giving any indication of what he intended to do next. He took the elevator to the lobby, walked through the space that had admitted him so reluctantly, exited through the main entrance that he'd used hours earlier when the evening still held promise of profit rather than humiliation. The October night air was cold against Johnson's face as he stood on the sidewalk outside the Waldorf-Astoria, his breath visible in the chill, his mind continuing to work through the implications and requirements of what would come next. He'd been publicly humiliated by a white servant in front of wealthy white businessmen who represented potential profits and potential relationships. If he allowed this insult to stand, if he simply returned to Harlem and resumed his normal activities, word would spread that Bumpy Johnson could be degraded without consequences, that his reputation for responding to disrespect was merely performance rather than reality. Johnson walked for several blocks, using the movement to process his anger and to formulate his response. He found a telephone booth on Madison Avenue and began making calls to men in Harlem, men who'd worked with him for years, men who understood that when Bumpy Johnson summoned them, questions were unnecessary and immediate response was expected. 6 men received calls that night. 6 men who would join Johnson for what would become the most brutal night in New York's recent criminal history. The men Johnson summoned arrived at a predetermined location in Harlem within 90 minutes of his calls, each one having dropped whatever they'd been doing to respond to Johnson's summons. They were hard men, men who'd proven their capabilities and their loyalty through years of work in Harlem's underworld. Men who didn't ask questions when Johnson explained that tonight's work would involve traveling to Manhattan to address an insult that demanded response. Johnson explained the situation concisely. He'd been publicly humiliated by a barman at the Waldorf-Astoria, called racial slurs in front of wealthy white businessmen, denied service because of his race in a setting where his presence had been officially sanctioned. The insult required a response that would demonstrate to everyone involved, to the barman, to the guests who'd witnessed the humiliation, to all of Manhattan's elite who would eventually hear the story, that disrespecting Bumpy Johnson carried consequences regardless of where that disrespect occurred. The plan Johnson outlined was methodical rather than impulsive. They would return to the Waldorf-Astoria, would enter through service entrances that Johnson's connections had identified, would locate the barman who delivered the insult, and would provide him with an opportunity to apologize. If the barman chose to apologize, to acknowledge his wrongdoing and to beg forgiveness on his knees before Johnson. Then the consequences would be limited to the humiliation of public submission. If the barman refused, if he continued to believe that his white skin protected him from consequences, then the response would be physical and would be severe enough to ensure that everyone who heard about tonight's events would understand what happened to people who disrespected Bumpy Johnson. Johnson's men listened without comment, understanding that this wasn't about debate or discussion, but about executing a plan that Johnson had already decided upon. They loaded into 2 vehicles, drove from Harlem through the nighttime streets toward Manhattan, crossed the boundary that separated Black Harlem from White Manhattan with the quiet determination of men embarking on a mission that would define reputations and establish precedents. The Waldorf-Astoria service areas occupied the basement and lower floors of the building, a network of kitchens and storage rooms and employee facilities that most guests never saw, but that made the hotel's famous service possible. Johnson had obtained detailed information about these areas through contacts who worked in Manhattan's hospitality industry, contacts who provided intelligence that proved valuable for various purposes and who were well compensated for their assistance. Johnson's team entered the hotel through a loading dock entrance at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, moving past drowsy security guards who'd been paid earlier in the evening to be elsewhere when specific visitors arrived. The payments had been arranged through intermediaries who'd contacted the guards with offers they couldn't refuse, offers that combined financial incentives with implied threats about what might happen to guards who interfered with whatever was planned. The party in Castellano's suite was still ongoing when Johnson's team arrived, though the poker game had apparently concluded and guests were now simply drinking and socializing. Johnson had obtained this information through calls to contacts who maintained awareness of such events, who could confirm that the barman was still working, still serving drinks to guests who'd witnessed Johnson's humiliation hours earlier. Johnson's approach to the suite was deliberate and unhurried. He walked through the hotel service corridors with the confidence of someone who belonged there, his men following in formation that suggested professional purpose rather than criminal intent. Any employee who encountered them assumed they were hotel staff or security, people with legitimate reasons to be in areas normally restricted from guests. The suite service entrance connected to a small pantry area where the barman prepared drinks before carrying them to guests in the main rooms. Johnson's team positioned themselves at this entrance, waiting for the moment when the barman would return to refill his tray. The wait lasted approximately 15 minutes, during which Johnson stood motionless, his patience absolute, his determination unwavering. The barman entered the pantry carrying an empty tray and stopped abruptly when he saw Johnson standing in the doorway, flanked by men whose expressions suggested they weren't hotel employees. The barman's face shifted through several emotions rapidly: confusion, recognition, fear, and then something like defiance as he apparently decided that even now, even with these men blocking his escape, his white skin would protect him from serious consequences. Johnson spoke quietly, his voice carrying the controlled intensity that people who knew him recognized as more dangerous than shouting. He explained the situation simply. The barman had publicly insulted him hours earlier, had called him names that no man should tolerate, had denied him service because of his race in front of people whose respect Johnson required. Johnson was offering the barman an opportunity to make amends, to apologize publicly, to admit his wrongdoing, and to beg forgiveness in terms that would restore Johnson's dignity in front of those same witnesses. The apology, Johnson explained, would need to be delivered in the main room where guests were still drinking, would need to be spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear, would need to include specific acknowledgement of the words the barman had used and specific expression of regret for having spoken them. The barman would kneel while delivering this apology, would remain on his knees until Johnson indicated he could stand, would accept whatever additional humiliation Johnson decided was appropriate as penance for his initial insult. The barman's response revealed that he still didn't understand what was happening, still believed that his white skin and the hotel's prestigious setting would somehow protect him from a black man's anger. He laughed, actually laughed, and told Johnson that he wasn't going to apologize to any colored man for telling the truth, that Johnson could go back to Harlem where he belonged, that if Johnson touched him, there would be police involved and Johnson would spend years in prison for assaulting a white man. The barman's confidence was based on assumptions that had been true throughout his life. Assumptions that white men could say anything to black men without facing physical consequences, that the legal system would always protect white people from black anger, that racial hierarchy was so absolute that even a black gangster wouldn't dare to strike a white man in a Manhattan hotel. These assumptions had served the barman well for 35 years. Tonight, they would fail him catastrophically. Chapter 4. The Most Brutal Hour. Johnson nodded once at the barman's refusal. The same gesture he'd made hours earlier when walking away from the initial insult. The gesture that signaled acceptance of a situation that couldn't be changed through words. But this time, the gesture didn't precede departure. This time, the gesture signaled the beginning of consequences that the barman had chosen through his continued defiance. Two of Johnson's men moved forward with practiced efficiency, seizing the barman before he could react, clamping hands over his mouth before he could scream, immobilizing him with techniques developed through years of enforcement work in Harlem's underworld. The barman struggled, his eyes wide with sudden terror, as he understood that the assumptions protecting him had somehow failed, that this black man was actually going to touch him, was actually going to hurt him, was actually going to make him pay for words that should have carried no consequences. Johnson stepped closer to the immobilized barman and spoke quietly, explaining exactly what was about to happen. The barman had been offered an opportunity to apologize and had refused. The barman had doubled down on his racism, had continued to insult Johnson even when presented with clear evidence that Johnson possessed both the capability and the willingness to respond with force. The barman had made his choice, and now the barman would experience the consequences of that choice. The consequences were administered with methodical precision rather than frenzied violence. Johnson's men understood that the goal wasn't to kill the barman, wasn't even to injure him so severely that he'd be unable to tell others what had happened. The goal was to hurt him badly enough that the story of tonight's events would spread throughout Manhattan's elite circles, would be repeated by everyone who heard it, would establish clearly and permanently that insulting Bumpy Johnson carried physical costs that no white privilege could prevent. They started with the barman's hands, the hands that had gestured dismissively while refusing to serve Johnson, the hands that had poured drinks for white guests while denying the same service to a black man. Fingers were bent backward past their natural limits, joints dislocated with controlled force that caused tremendous pain without causing permanent crippling. The barman screamed into the hands covering his mouth, his body convulsing with agony, his eyes streaming tears that mixed with the sweat of terror covering his face. They moved to the barman's ribs, delivering measured blows that cracked bone without puncturing lungs, that would cause weeks of pain with every breath without creating life-threatening injuries. The precision of the violence demonstrated experience showed that these men knew exactly how to hurt someone severely while keeping them alive and conscious, knew how to inflict maximum suffering without crossing lines that would transform assault into murder. The barman's face was spared initially, left unmarked so that his screams could be heard and so that the terror in his eyes could be witnessed by Johnson, who stood watching the proceedings with the calm expression of someone observing necessary business rather than enjoying cruelty. But when the barman, during a moment when the hand covering his mouth shifted, managed to spit at Johnson and to repeat the racial slur he'd used earlier, Johnson's expression hardened, and he nodded permission for his men to address the barman's face. The beating that followed was more severe than what had preceded it. The barman's nose was broken with a single precise blow. His jaw was dislocated with another. His teeth, the teeth that had formed the words insulting Johnson, were systematically knocked out until the barman's mouth was a ruin of blood and broken enamel. Throughout this process, the barman remained conscious, remained aware of what was happening to him, remained able to understand that this agony was the direct result of words he'd chosen to speak hours earlier. When the violence concluded, the barman was barely recognizable as the confident racist who'd refused service to a black man. He lay on the pantry floor, his hands swollen and useless, his ribs cracked, his face destroyed, his consciousness fading in and out as his body struggled to process the trauma it had received. Johnson knelt beside him, spoke quietly into his one ear that hadn't been damaged, and delivered a message that the barman would remember for the rest of his life. The message was simple. The barman had insulted Bumpy Johnson and had refused to apologize when given the opportunity. The barman had assumed that his white skin would protect him from consequences that black people faced routinely for far lesser offenses. The barman had been wrong, and when the barman recovered, when he could speak again through his ruined mouth, he should tell everyone who asked what had happened tonight. He should explain that he'd called a black man a racial slur and had refused to apologize, and that the black man had returned with associates who'd administered justice that courts and police would never provide. But the barman wasn't the only person who would receive attention that night. During the beating, one of Johnson's men had quietly gathered information about which guests at the party had laughed at Johnson's humiliation, had made approving comments about the barman's racism, had contributed to the atmosphere that had encouraged the barman's defiance. For names emerged, for men who'd vocally supported the barman's treatment of Johnson, for men who'd apparently believed their wealth and their whiteness made them untouchable. These 4 men were located throughout the hotel over the following hours, found in their rooms or in the hotel's public spaces, intercepted by Johnson's team with the same efficiency that had captured the barman. Each received similar treatment, though calibrated to their specific level of involvement in Johnson's humiliation. The man who'd laughed loudest received the most severe beating. The man who'd merely nodded approval received injuries that were significant but less devastating. By 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 men associated with Johnson's humiliation had been beaten severely, had been left in locations where they would be found by hotel staff within hours, had been accompanied by notes explaining in simple terms why this had happened to them. The notes didn't mention Johnson by name, didn't provide evidence that could be used in prosecution, simply stated that the recipients had publicly insulted a guest at the hotel and had received appropriate consequences for their racism. Johnson and his team departed the Waldorf-Astoria through the same service entrances they'd used to enter, driving back to Harlem as the sun began to lighten the eastern sky. The night's work had been completed, the message had been delivered, and now came the phase where Johnson waited to see how Manhattan would respond to what had occurred. The response began later that Sunday morning when hotel staff discovered the barman unconscious in the pantry and 4 guests in various states of severe injury throughout the building. Police were summoned, investigations were initiated, and the Waldorf-Astoria became the center of attention that its management desperately didn't want. The story that emerged from interviews with victims and witnesses was confused and contradictory, but certain elements remained consistent. The barman had insulted a black guest, the black guest had left, and hours later the barman and 4 other men had been brutally beaten by unknown assailants. The police investigation proceeded along predictable lines. Detectives questioned everyone who'd been at Castellano's party, attempted to identify the black guest who'd been insulted, tried to determine whether that guest had connections to the violence that followed. But witnesses proved remarkably unhelpful, either claiming they hadn't noticed any black guest at the party or claiming they couldn't provide useful descriptions of someone who'd left before the violence occurred. Castellano himself was particularly unhelpful, providing vague answers that suggested he was protecting someone, that he understood exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible, but had decided that cooperation with police would be more dangerous than silence. His reticence frustrated detectives, but couldn't be compelled, and without his testimony, there was no direct connection between the unknown black guest and the subsequent beatings. The victims themselves provided contradictory information. The barman, once he regained consciousness and could communicate through his broken jaw, insisted that he'd been attacked by random criminals who'd invaded the hotel, that the beating had nothing to do with any guest he'd served, that he had no idea why anyone would target him specifically. His story was obviously false, but he maintained it adamantly, apparently more afraid of identifying his attackers than of failing to bring them to justice. The 4 other victims told similar stories, denying any connection between their injuries and events at Castellano's party, insisting they'd been attacked by strangers for reasons they couldn't understand. Their fear was palpable to the detectives who interviewed them, the terror of men who discovered that wealth and whiteness provided less protection than they'd assumed, who understood that identifying their attackers might result in consequences even worse than what they'd already experienced. Without cooperative victims, without witnesses willing to provide useful information, without physical evidence connecting specific perpetrators to the violence, the police investigation stalled and eventually was filed as unsolved. Officially, 5 men had been beaten severely by unknown assailants for unknown reasons, and the case would remain open indefinitely without any realistic prospect of resolution. But unofficially, everyone who mattered knew exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible. The story spread through Manhattan's elite circles within days, passed from person to person with the kind of fascinated horror that accompanied tales of violence, intruding into spaces that should have been safe. A barman had insulted a black gangster from Harlem, had refused to apologize when given the opportunity, and had been beaten nearly to death along with 4 wealthy white men who'd supported his racism. The story's implications were clear to everyone who heard it. Bumpy Johnson could reach anyone, anywhere, could deliver consequences that police couldn't prevent and courts couldn't punish, could make wealthy white people pay for racism that they'd assumed was their privilege to express without consequence. The protection that came from money and whiteness extended only so far, ended at the boundary where a black man with sufficient power and sufficient determination decided that an insult demanded response. The Waldorf-Astoria incident became legendary in New York's underworld, a story repeated in speakeasies and social clubs and private gatherings throughout the city. The details varied in different tellings, sometimes exaggerating the violence, sometimes adding flourishes that hadn't actually occurred, but the core message remained consistent. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated that disrespecting him carried physical consequences regardless of the disrespecter's race or wealth or social position. The incident changed how white businessmen and criminals throughout New York interacted with Johnson and with black gangsters generally. Men who might previously have expressed casual racism when dealing with colored criminals now chose their words more carefully, considered the potential consequences of insults that had once seemed risk-free. The hierarchy that placed white criminals above black criminals regardless of actual power and capability had been challenged in ways that couldn't be ignored. Johnson himself never publicly acknowledged involvement in the Waldorf-Astoria beatings. When asked about the incident by associates or by journalists who'd heard rumors, he simply smiled and changed the subject, neither confirming nor denying responsibility. The ambiguity served his interests better than explicit acknowledgement would have, created uncertainty that magnified the fear surrounding his reputation, suggested that similar consequences might follow any insult without Johnson having to commit to specific threats. The barman who'd started everything never fully recovered from his injuries. His hands healed improperly, leaving him unable to perform the fine motor tasks that bartending required. His face required multiple surgeries that couldn't fully restore his appearance. His jaw never aligned correctly, leaving him with a speech impediment that reminded him daily of the words that had cost him so dearly. He eventually left New York entirely, moved to a small town in the Midwest where no one knew his history, where he could attempt to build a new life without the constant reminder of a night when his racism had met consequences. The 4 other victims experienced various degrees of recovery. Some resumed their wealthy lives with minimal lasting effects beyond the psychological trauma of having been beaten by black men who'd acted with impunity. Others suffered permanent disabilities that served as constant reminders of their vulnerability. All of them learned lessons that they'd carry for the rest of their lives about the limits of the protection that wealth and whiteness actually provided. For Bumpy Johnson, the Waldorf-Astoria incident represented something larger than personal revenge. It demonstrated that the principles he'd established in Harlem, that disrespect carried consequences, that racism against him would not be tolerated, extended beyond his home territory into spaces that should have been controlled by white power. Manhattan's elite had assumed they were immune to the violence that characterized Harlem's underworld, had believed their hotels and their private parties existed in separate spheres where black gangsters had no reach. That assumption had been proven catastrophically wrong. The incident also strengthened Johnson's position in Harlem itself. Word spread through the community that their leader had struck back against white racism in the heart of Manhattan, had demonstrated that black people didn't have to accept humiliation passively, had proven that power could be exercised across the racial boundaries that white America assumed were impermeable. Johnson became more than just a successful gangster, became a symbol of black resistance and black capability in an era when both were systematically denied and suppressed. The relationships Johnson had cultivated with wealthy white businessmen evolved in the aftermath of the Waldorf incident. Some men distanced themselves, too frightened by what Johnson had demonstrated to continue associations that might put them at risk. But others drew closer, recognizing that Johnson's demonstrated willingness to use violence made him valuable as an ally and dangerous as an enemy. These men treated Johnson with new respect, invited him to gatherings where his presence was welcomed rather than merely tolerated, accepted him as someone whose power demanded acknowledgement regardless of his race. The most brutal night in New York had accomplished what years of moral arguments and legal challenges had failed to achieve. It had forced white Manhattan to recognize that black Harlem possessed power that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. The recognition came through fear rather than through respect, through violence rather than through persuasion, but it came nonetheless, changing the dynamics between black and white New York in ways that would echo for decades. Johnson understood that what he'd done at the Waldorf-Astoria was a model that couldn't be replicated indefinitely. The violence had worked because it was unexpected, because white Manhattan had assumed such things couldn't happen in their protected spaces. If similar incidents became common, police response would escalate, white retaliation would intensify, and the cost would eventually exceed the benefits. The Waldorf incident was a statement, a demonstration of capability and will, not a template for ongoing operations. But the statement had been made, had been heard throughout New York's interconnected worlds of legitimate wealth and criminal enterprise, had established principles that would govern interactions between black and white power for years to come. Bumpy Johnson had walked into the Waldorf-Astoria as an invited guest, had been humiliated by a racist servant, and had returned to deliver consequences that no amount of money or privilege could prevent. The barman's words on that October evening had taken 3 seconds to speak. The consequences had taken 3 hours to unfold. And the legend that emerged from that brutal night would last for generations. A story told whenever someone needed reminding that respect costs nothing, but disrespect costs everything, and that the man who learned that lesson most painfully was a barman who'd assumed his white skin made him untouchable. That was the night that changed New York. That was the brutal response that established Bumpy Johnson as someone whose dignity could not be violated without consequence. That was how one man's refusal to accept humiliation became a legend that transformed how power operated across racial lines in America's greatest city.